At our family gathering in San Antonio, my father looked at me with genuine confusion and asked, Marcel, hija, why did you arrive in an Uber? Did the car I gave you for your birthday break down? I opened my mouth to explain, but before a single word could escape, my husband, Javier, leaned back in his chair with that familiar smirk and said, Oh, that car? It belongs to my mother now. She needed it more than Marisol. My father went silent, completely, chillingly silent, and what he did next filled me with a pride so deep it still echoes in my chest today. Before we begin, my friends watching this story, please drop a comment and tell me which city you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can keep growing and sharing more powerful stories like this one. My name is Marisol Alvarez Morales, wife to Javier Morales and mother of little Valeria. And the story I'm about to tell is the story of how a woman breaks quietly, long before anyone sees the cracks. It happened on a Sunday, one of those suffocatingly bright Texas afternoons where even the wind feels tired. My family was gathering at my father's estate, inside El Encanto Residencial, a gated community so exclusive that people lower their voices when they mention it. My father, Don Rafael Alvarez, built that house with the same discipline he built his businesses, with hard work, sharp instincts, and a heart that knew how to give without expecting applause. He raised me among people who believed in honor, in showing up on time, in treating others with dignity. Yet, there I was, arriving late to my own family's gathering, stepping out of an Uber like a stranger, like someone who didn't belong to the Alvarez name at all. And you know why? Because Javier decided that the Mercedes-Benz my father gifted me for my birthday, my gift, my one piece of independence, was better off in the hands of his mother, Elena Morales. According to him, she needed it more because her friends at church looked down on her old car. He said that with the same smirk he always wore when he wanted me to feel small, the same smirk I had forgiven too many times. So, I arrived at the estate with my dress clinging to my knees from the heat, my hair sticking to my neck, and my dignity hanging by a thread. I knew the moment I stepped out of that Uber that every aunt, uncle, cousin, and distant relative gathered inside would wonder why the daughter of Don Rafael was arriving like someone who had borrowed a ride from a neighbor. I stood outside the stone archway of the house for a full minute, trying to breathe, trying to gather myself so no one would see the truth behind my eyes. Because that's the thing about being a Latina wife. We learn early how to hide the storms. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors, and the room fell silent in a way that cut straight through me. The Alvarez gatherings were always loud. My tia Rosa with her booming laugh, my tío Manuel telling the same stories he'd told for 20 years, cousins chasing little ones around the coals. But when I walked in, silence spread through the room like someone had dimmed the sun. Their eyes went first to the damp hem of my dress, then to my shoes, dusty from the gravel driveway, then finally to my face. I could feel their questions, their confusion, their concern. And among all those faces, the only one that carried no worry at all was Javier's. My husband didn't stand, didn't offer his hand, didn't even pull out the chair next to him. He just kept chewing his food, smiling at something my cousin Carlos had said, acting as if his wife arriving alone and uncomfortable was nothing more than another passing breeze in this Texas heat. But my father, sitting at the head of the long table, saw everything. Don Rafael had a way of seeing people, not the masks they wore, but the truth behind their eyes. He looked at me slowly, taking in every detail, and in that single moment, I knew I could no longer hide what I had been trying to cover for years. He knew I wasn't late because I overslept. He knew I wasn't tired because of work. He knew something was wrong, and I was running out of excuses. I walked toward him, kissed his hand like I always did, and felt the weight of his gaze when he asked, in that deep, steady voice that could silence any room, "Marisol, hija, why did you come in an Uber? Did something happen to the Mercedes?" The question hit me harder than he could ever know, because he didn't just give me that car. He gave me freedom. He gave me something that was mine in a world where everything I owned seemed to slip through Javier's fingers. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. My throat tightened, my lips trembled, and before I could form a single word, Javier spoke for me. With his fork still in his hand and his voice full of casual arrogance, he said, "Papa Rafael, my mom has the Mercedes now. She needed it more than Marisol. She has to keep up with the ladies at church. You know how it is." He chuckled like it was a joke, like my humiliation was entertainment. The entire table froze. My mother-in-law, Elena, wasn't even there. She was probably driving around San Antonio, showing off the car like she had earned it herself. I lowered my head, swallowed the bitter taste in my mouth, and pretended his words didn't cut into me. But my father, he didn't laugh, didn't smile, didn't blink. He just looked at Javier, the way a lion looks at a man who doesn't realize he's already dead. And as I stood there, feeling like the world was closing in on me, something inside me shifted. For years, I had tried to be small, to be gentle, to be agreeable, to be the kind of woman who didn't disturb the water. I hid my talents, my intelligence, my strength, because I believed a peaceful marriage depended on a quiet wife. But in that moment, standing in my father's house, stripped of pride by the man who claimed to love me, I felt something deep and long buried awaken in my chest. A reminder of who I was before Javier. A reminder of what I had been capable of. A reminder that the woman I used to be was still alive, and she was tired of swallowing pain. My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply set down his spoon, adjusted the cuff of his shirt the way he did before making decisions that changed entire businesses, and looked at Javier with a calmness that made the room feel colder than the air conditioning ever could. "So," he said slowly, "the Mercedes-Benz I gave my daughter is now with your mother." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a confirmation of disrespect spoken out loud so everyone could taste the shame of it. Javier nodded, proud of himself, proud of the logic he thought made him look generous and devoted to his mother. "Sí, Don Rafael," he replied, puffing up his chest like a man who thought he had done something noble. "My mother deserves to be respected. Her car was old. Marisol just goes to work and comes home. She doesn't need such a fancy car. His words carved into me, each one a reminder of how he saw me. Small, unnecessary, ordinary. He said it casually, like I was furniture he was rearranging, like my comfort was an afterthought. My father stared at him, and for a moment, I thought this would be the moment he exploded. But Don Rafael Alvarez had never been a man of explosions. He was a man of storms, silent, slow building, devastating. The kind of storms you don't see coming until they're already ripping your life apart. I see, he finally said, nodding as if Javier had presented a reasonable business proposal. Your mother needed it more. Javier grinned, believing he had won approval. He had no idea those were the last moments of comfort he would ever have inside my father's home. I could feel my chest tightening, my breath shallow, my fingernails digging into the fabric of my dress. It wasn't just the humiliation of the car. It was everything I had swallowed for years. The insults disguised as jokes, the decisions he made without me, the way he spoke about my family, the way he spoke to me when no one else was listening. There is a moment in every woman's life when she realizes she has allowed too much. And in that moment, a quiet fury grows inside her, a fury that no longer cares about being polite. I felt that fury rising inside me. But before I could speak, before I could defend myself against the man who had taken so much from me, my father lifted his phone from the table. He didn't look at it. He didn't scroll. His fingers moved with the precision of a man who knew exactly which button would set everything in motion. One single message, a command was sent. And Javier, poor fool, kept eating as if nothing in his life had just shifted. I looked at my father in confusion, but he gave me one of those silent glances, the kind that said, I see everything, Hija, and I will handle this. That's the thing about my father. He never protected me with lectures or warnings. He protected me with actions, swift and absolute. Within minutes, while we sat at that long table pretending the air wasn't vibrating with tension, the asset recovery team from Alvarez Enterprises was already receiving the order. I didn't know that yet, but I would soon. What I did know was that my father reached for his cup of coffee, lifted it to his lips, and took a slow sip, as if savoring a flavor only he could taste. It was the calm before the destruction. I sat beside Javier, the man who once promised he would cherish me, but instead treated me like an accessory to his ego, and I watched him laugh with my cousins while I sat there feeling smaller than I had felt in years. Every time he laughed, something in my chest twisted. Every time he joked, something inside me cracked. How many times had I made myself small so he could feel big? How many dreams had I tucked away just to keep peace in a marriage that gave me nothing but wounds? They didn't know who I was. Not really. Not the real me. Javier certainly didn't. My father knew pieces of me. My cousins knew fragments. But no one, absolutely no one, knew the truth I had buried so deep I had almost forgotten it myself. I had been at the top of my class at UT Austin. I had been offered a position at a prestigious engineering firm in Dallas, a position that few Latinas ever got offered at that time. I had been fluent in 3 coding languages before most people knew what coding even meant. I was supposed to be someone, but love, or what I thought was love, made me choose a smaller life. I told myself that Javier needed me, that he needed support, not competition. And I sacrificed opportunities to lift him up. I shrank my dreams so his could grow. My father had begged me not to. He saw the ambition in me, the hunger to do something meaningful with my life, the talent that could have changed the trajectory of our family legacy. But I wanted to be a good wife. I wanted to build something with Javier. I wanted us to be a team. I never imagined I would become a shadow in my own life. My father had warned me, El amor no debe convertirte en menos, hija. Love should not make you smaller, but I didn't listen. And now, here I was, sitting at a table full of relatives, feeling like a ghost in my own story, while my husband boasted about giving away the one gift that represented my independence. Then, somewhere across San Antonio, at La Cantera Mall, while Javier continued eating his steak and bragging about his mother, the Mercedes-Benz Elena Morales was so proudly showing off, began to scream, literally scream. The alarm system engaged, the engine locked, the doors sealed, and the automated voice my father's security team installed echoed. Unauthorized use detected. Asset lockdown activated. I didn't know this yet, but somehow, deep inside, I felt something shift, like justice had taken its first breath. In that moment, as Javier lifted his glass to his lips, I suddenly realized something important. I had spent years giving pieces of myself away to a man who never saw my worth, but my father did. And now, for the first time in a long time, I felt something warm spread across my chest, a feeling I hadn't felt in years. Not victory, not relief, but recognition. Recognition of myself. I wasn't done. I wasn't defeated. And I sure as hell wasn't going to stay silent anymore. While Javier kept laughing, oblivious to the storm unfolding miles away, the phone in his pocket buzzed loudly against the wood of the dining table. At first, he ignored it. He always ignored calls unless they benefited him. But the vibration persisted, frantic and desperate, until even my tío Manuel frowned and asked, Mijo, your phone is about to jump off the table. You better answer it. Javier sighed dramatically, as if the world was inconveniencing him yet again, then looked down and saw the name glowing on the screen. Mama. His grin widened. He thought she was calling to thank him for the car, to praise him for being the perfect son who had sacrificed his wife's comfort for her vanity. He answered loudly enough for everyone at the table to hear. Bueno, Mommy, are you loving the... But the words died in his throat. From where I sat, even without hearing her clearly, I could recognize the sound. It was the sound of a woman's world collapsing. Elena's voice came through the speaker, shrill, chaotic, cracking under panic. She wasn't thanking him. She was screaming about alarms blaring inside the car, screaming about being trapped, screaming about people recording her, screaming that security guards were dragging her out in front of everyone. Her humiliation poured out of the phone like boiling water, splashing over Javier's pride until the color drained from his face. What do you mean it locked you inside? Javier snapped, suddenly furious. What do you mean they're towing it? What thugs? Mommy, calm down, calm down. His face reddened, then paled, then reddened again, like his body couldn't decide whether to burn from rage or freeze from fear. My father didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't turn his head. He simply continued cutting his food, calm and steady, as if he had always known this moment would come. The rest of the family exchanged looks, some confused, some intrigued, some satisfied. But no one dared speak. The silence wrapped around Javier like a rope tightening with every second he stood there, shaking. Then, as if humiliation wasn't enough, Elena shouted something that made even his bones tremble. I was locked inside like a criminal. Everyone was watching. Everyone recorded me. They said the car belonged to Alvarez Enterprises, not you. The room froze as the truth finally sank into Javier's thick skull. The car wasn't stolen back. It had been taken by the rightful owner, my father. And Javier was only now realizing he had poked a sleeping giant. He ended the call abruptly when Elena began sobbing uncontrollably, then turned toward me so quickly the chair screeched across the marble floor. Rage twisted his features, and in his fury, he forgot where he was, forgot the people watching, forgot the man sitting at the head of the table who could destroy him with a single breath. He pointed a shaking finger at my face, inches from my cheek, like I was a child he was disciplining. What did you do, Marisol? He shouted, loud enough for the walls to tremble. What did you do to my mother? Why did you send people to humiliate her? The audacity, the shamelessness, the stupidity. After years of draining me emotionally, after stripping me of dignity in private and now in public, he had the nerve to accuse me. He blamed me for the consequences of his own arrogance. I stared at him, letting the anger burn silently under my skin. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I didn't owe him a single word. And then, just when Javier inhaled, about to launch into another accusation, my father rose from his chair. Don Rafael Alvarez did not raise his voice. He did not slam his hands on the table. He simply stood. And the room transformed. Every relative straightened in their seats. Every whisper died. Every breath held. Even Javier froze, his mouth still open mid-yell. My father's presence was not loud, but it was heavy. The kind of weight that bends men who have no spine. He walked slowly toward us, his boots tapping against the marble floors, each step deliberate, each breath steady. When he reached Javier, he stopped just close enough to let him feel the cold edge of his disappointment. There is no problem, my father said, his voice smooth but sharp. The vehicle has been recovered because its original owner determined it was being misused. Javier blinked, confused. Misused. The word hung in the air like a verdict. My father didn't give him time to speak. And since I hear that your mother needs her son, he added calmly, I suggest you go to her immediately. She is standing outside La Cantera Mall in the heat. You should take care of your family, see? Javier swallowed hard. I can't, he stammered. I have to return to the office. My father almost smiled. Almost. No, he replied. You do not. The calmness in his voice was terrifying. As of 5 o'clock this afternoon, your employment with Alvarez Enterprises has been terminated. The words fell like a guillotine. Javier staggered back, color draining from his face. What? You can't fire me. You gave me that job. And I can take what I give, my father said, not unkindly. You abused your position. You abused your privileges. And you disrespected my daughter. Then my father extended his hand. Now, give me the keys to the company vehicle you arrived in. Javier didn't move, couldn't move. So my father stepped closer, just an inch, his voice low and cold as a winter morning in a Texas desert. Give me the keys, Javier. Hands trembling, Javier dug into his pockets and placed the keys into my father's palm. It felt like watching him hand over the last piece of his dignity. But my father wasn't done. He reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, folded it neatly, and slipped it into Javier's chest pocket. For your ride, he said softly. An Uber will be cheaper. And since you said Marisol should learn to save money, maybe you should take your own advice. 2 security guards appeared behind Javier, not touching him, not speaking to him, just standing there, silent reminders that his time inside this house was over. Javier looked at me one last time, hoping I would defend him, beg for him, save him. But I didn't look back. I reached for my glass of water, calm and deliberate, and sipped as if nothing in the world concerned me. Because in that moment, for the first time in years, nothing about him did. Javier Morales left the Alvarez estate drenched in humiliation, stripped of his job, his pride, and every privilege he had sucked from my family. What he didn't know, not yet, was that this humiliation was only the beginning. For him and for me. Because the woman he thought would stay silent forever had finally opened her eyes. When the gates of El Encanto Residencial closed behind Javier, sealing him outside in the brutal Texas heat, the silence inside the estate felt strangely peaceful, like a storm had passed and left the air trembling in its aftermath. But the truth was, the storm hadn't passed. Not for him, and certainly not for me. I watched the last sliver of his shadow disappear through the iron bars, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to relief. Not happiness, not yet, but the beginning of a breath I had forgotten how to take. Inside the dining hall, the family slowly returned to their conversations, each voice soft, cautious, as if afraid to disturb whatever spell my father had just cast. I could feel their glances on me, sympathy from some, judgment from others, curiosity from those who had always suspected that Javier was not the man he pretended to be. But I didn't care about any of them. My entire focus was on the quiet strength radiating from my father as he returned to his seat and resumed his meal, as if he had simply taken out the trash. My tío Manuel leaned in toward him and murmured, "Bien hecho, compadre." But my father didn't react. He never took pride in correcting people. He took pride in protecting his own. I should have felt grateful. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt triumphant watching Javier get stripped of everything he used to control me. And somewhere, deep inside, I did. But underneath that, there was something else. Something heavy, something bitter, something that tasted like regret mixed with rage. Not rage at Javier, rage at myself. Because I had let this go on for far too long. I excused him. I defended him. I convinced myself that a woman's patience could fix a man's flaws, that love meant enduring the cuts as long as they weren't fatal. But the thing about small cuts is that, over time, they bleed you dry. I stared at my plate, the food untouched, my appetite gone. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of the truth settling over me. Javier hadn't broken me in a day. He had broken me slowly, quietly, so quietly, I didn't even hear the cracks forming. I had helped him do it. The family resumed their conversations, but I couldn't hear anything except my own thoughts. I remembered every time I had driven to pick him up when he forgot his wallet. Every bill I paid so he wouldn't look bad in front of his friends. Every moment I dimmed my own achievements so he could feel bigger, so he wouldn't call me too much. Every dream I hid so he wouldn't accuse me of thinking I was better than him. Every tear I cried in silence because, he said, crying made me dramatic. Every lonely night I spent waiting for him to come home from work, which never really kept him late. And worst of all, every time I convinced myself that this was normal, that this was marriage, that this was my role as a Latina wife, taught by generations of women who learned to endure, to stay quiet, to sacrifice themselves in the name of familia. But I wasn't my mother. I wasn't my grandmother. And I was done being quiet. Before dessert could be served, my father leaned toward me and spoke softly so only I could hear. Higa, he said, you don't have to go home with that man ever again. Something inside me cracked open, but not from pain, from release. I know, Papa, I whispered back. He nodded once, decisive. And that was that. My father never wasted words. When he said something, it wasn't a suggestion. It was true. After the gathering ended, I pretended to help my tias clean up, but my mind was racing. I didn't know where Javier was now. Maybe he was standing outside the gates calling his mother, calling anyone who would listen. Maybe he was already walking in the scorching heat toward the main road, cursing me with every step. Maybe he was plotting how to twist the story and make himself the victim. That was always his talent, playing wounded to hide the harm he caused. But I didn't care about his footsteps or his curses. For the first time, I was thinking about my own. I stepped outside into the courtyard, where the sun was beginning to dip behind the hills. The sky glowed orange, then red, then the deep purple that always reminded me of my childhood in Texas, when life felt simpler and my future looked big, bright, unlimited. And that's when I heard it. My father's footsteps approaching behind me. Marcel, he called, gently but firmly. I turned. He looked at me with the tenderness only a Latino father can give his daughter, the kind that holds both pride and sorrow in the same breath. I know you've been hiding parts of yourself, he said. I know you dimmed your light so he could shine. but you were not born to be small. I hadn't told him anything, yet he knew everything. A lump formed in my throat. Papa, I thought love meant sacrifice. He shook his head slowly. Love is not meant to cage you, Hiha. Love is meant to set you free. And just like that, the truth I had been running from hit me all at once. I wasn't just angry at Javier. I was angry at myself for forgetting who I was before him. The girl who graduated top of her class, the woman who received job offers from companies that rarely hired Latinas. The mind is sharp enough to solve problems that others couldn't even define. The heart is brave enough to dream of a life larger than the one I settled for. I buried that woman. I buried her so deep that some days I forgot she ever existed. But she was still there. She had been waiting for me. My father placed a hand on my shoulder. Whatever comes next, he said, you face it with your head high. No more shrinking. No more silence. My eyes stung, but I didn't cry. Not anymore. Crying had been for the old Marisol, the woman who begged for scraps of affection. This Marisol, the one rising now, the one remembering who she was, didn't cry. She burned. I inhaled the hot Texas air, steadying myself. I'm ready, I said. My father nodded. Good, because the next part won't be easy. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. Deep down, I already knew. Javier was not done with me. Men like him never accept consequences. They seek revenge. And Elena, a woman like her, vain, injured, humiliated publicly, she would not sit quietly. Trouble was coming. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. Because the woman I used to be, the woman I was supposed to become, had awakened. And she was not going back to sleep. The moment my father told me the next part wouldn't be easy, I knew he was preparing me for something far darker than Javier's humiliation or Elena's public meltdown. Trouble had a way of circling back when wounded pride was involved, and with the Morales family, pride was their religion. Still, I didn't expect it to come so fast. Before I could even leave El Encanto Residential, before the last plates from the family gathering were washed and put away, before the Texas sky even let the night settle in, my phone lit up with Javier's name. He called first, then again, then again. 3 calls in a row, each one more frantic than the last. I didn't answer. I didn't even consider it. I stood by my father's fountain with the water glistening under the evening lights. And I watched Javier's name flash again and again until it eventually disappeared. Then came the messages, dozens of them. First demanding, then pleading, then insulting. Classic Javier. Anger wrapped in desperation. Desperation wrapped in manipulation. You think you won something today? He wrote. You ruined everything. Are you proud of yourself? You let your father humiliate me. You let everyone laugh at my mother. You're not innocent in this. You're cruel. You're cold. You never supported me. The irony nearly made me laugh. I had supported that man more than I had ever supported myself. I had paid bills that weren't mine, sacrificed dreams he never knew about, carried burdens he never noticed, and molded my entire life around his insecurities so he wouldn't feel small. And after all that, he dared to say I didn't support him. I turned the phone off. The silence was delicious. But silence doesn't last long when a wounded ego is clawing at the edges of your life. Around 20 minutes later, a message came in from an unknown number. When I opened it, stomach tightened, not from fear, but from a sick kind of recognition. It was Elena. Even in text form, you could feel her venom. "You embarrassed me today," her message read. "I was treated like a criminal. The whole mall saw me being dragged out. You will regret allowing your father to do this. This is not over, Marisol." She didn't sign it, but she didn't have to. Only Elena wrote threats with that much perfume and poison. I stared at the message, feeling nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not anger, not fear, just an endless, exhausted numbness that felt like the quiet after a fire burns everything down. That was the moment I realized how far gone I had been for so many years. My body didn't even react anymore. The panic that once defined me had been replaced by something steadier, something colder, clarity. I didn't respond to her either. Instead, I slipped the phone into my bag, walked down the stone path toward my father's office inside the estate, and knocked once before entering. He looked up immediately, like he had been waiting for this moment. "They're already attacking," I said simply. "Of course they are," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "People who depend on your silence panic when you stop being quiet." I sank into the leather seat across from him. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," he said, clasping his hands together, "you take control of your life, Hiha, the way you should have years ago." There was no judgment in his voice, only certainty, the kind that came from knowing his daughter had survived a war no one else saw. He opened a drawer and slid a set of documents toward me. Legal papers, financial summaries, a thick envelope filled with information. "These are yours," he said. "Everything I've built will one day pass to you and Valeria. But I don't want you waiting until one day. I want you to step into your place now, not after more pain, not after more humiliation. Now." My breath caught in my chest. For years, I had avoided this moment. The moment where I had to step out of the small life I built around Javier and return to the larger one I was destined for. A life that required strength, strategy, intelligence. The very things I had buried to keep peace in my marriage. "Papa," I whispered, emotion tightening my throat. "I don't know if I can." "Marisol," he cut in softly, "you have always been stronger than you allow yourself to be." His voice lowered. "You just forgot." And maybe he was right. Maybe love, or the shadow of what I thought was love, had convinced me I wasn't enough. That I needed to shrink myself to keep a man whole. That I had to choose between being loved and being powerful. But that was a lie. And I was done believing lies. My father watched me quietly, letting me take in the weight of the life waiting for me. After a long moment, he said, "You are going to need protection, Higa." "Protection?" I asked. "From what?" "From Javier?" He shook his head. "From yourself. From your guilt. From the version of you that stayed too long." His words cut deeper than any insult Javier had ever thrown at me, because they were true. I wasn't afraid Javier would come after me. I was afraid I would go back to him, afraid I would rationalize his behavior, afraid I would fall back into the old familiar pattern of forgiving the unforgivable, afraid I would forget the woman I was beginning to remember. Tomorrow, my father continued, I will send my legal team to file for separation, and we will ensure that everything, from property to custody, is handled with precision. Custody. The word echoed in my chest. Valeria, my little girl, my reason, my heart. My father must have seen the fear flash across my face, because he leaned forward and spoke with a certainty that anchored me back to the earth. He will not take her from you, he said. I promise you that. A breath I didn't know I was holding finally escaped. That was when the front gates buzzed, a sharp, grating, angry buzz that cut through the night. My father's security team rushed to the monitors. The camera feed lit up. There he was, Javier Morales, standing at the gate, soaked in sweat, red with rage, screaming into the intercom, demanding to be let inside, demanding to speak to me, demanding explanations, demanding rights he no longer had. My father looked at the screen, then at me. Do you want to hear what he has to say? He asked. The question wasn't about Javier. It was about me. About whether I would slip back into the silence that had once protected him more than it ever protected me. I looked at Javier's distorted, furious face on the monitor. The man who had taken so much. The man who had drained me of everything I was. And I realized the truth. I had nothing left to hear. No, I said. Let him scream. And my father nodded once. The gate stayed closed, and Javier Morales screamed into the Texas night. Javier didn't stop screaming that night. Even after my father's guards warned him to leave the property, even after the lights of El Encanto Residencial dimmed and the warm Texas evening settled into the kind of quiet that makes the cicadas louder, Javier Morales kept unleashing every insult he could think of into the dark, demanding someone, anyone, care enough to come out and answer him. But no one did. I stood at the window of my childhood bedroom, watching him through the glass as he paced back and forth outside the gate, his body outlined by the streetlights, his anger lighting him from the inside like a flame he couldn't control. For years, that flame had burned me. Tonight, it burned him. My father eventually ordered security to call the police if he didn't leave, and when the patrol car turned the corner, Javier finally backed away. Not because he respected the law, but because he was afraid of being embarrassed even further. He left on foot, his silhouette shrinking down the long road that wound through oak trees and manicured lawns. I watched until he disappeared entirely, until there was nothing left but the stillness of the night and the weight of everything I had lost and everything I had finally found. I closed the curtains and sat on the edge of the bed, the same bed I had slept in as a girl, staring at the walls still decorated with small traces of the life I once dreamed for myself. College acceptance letters, old photographs of robotics competitions, medals I never mentioned to Javier, because every time he sensed I was proud of something, he shrank back. then lashed out like my success was salt on his insecurities. It was easier to hide my brilliance than deal with his resentment. I stared at one of the medals now, UT Austin, first place in engineering innovation, and something inside me tightened painfully. I could have been someone else. I could have lived a life I chose. Instead, I let love convince me that shrinking was the same thing as caring. I allowed myself to become a ghost of a woman who once had fire in her veins. But that fire, it was back. I didn't sleep that night. My mind raced, tangled between memories and regrets, between grief and anger, between who I was and who I had allowed myself to become. When dawn finally crept over San Antonio, painting the sky in shades of blue and gold, I was already dressed and in my father's kitchen, sipping a cup of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. My father walked in moments later, still wearing the same composure he had worn the night before. "Buenos dias, hija," he said. "Did you sleep?" "Not much," I answered. He nodded, as if he had expected that. "The legal team arrives at 9, he told me, but before they get here, there's something I want you to understand." I looked at him, waiting. "This fight is no longer about Javier," he said. "It's about you. It's about reclaiming a life that belongs to you." I swallowed hard. "Papa, I don't know where to start." He sat across from me, hands folded, eyes steady. "Then let's start with the truth," he said. "Tell me what happened in your marriage, all of it." The words punched the air from my lungs. I had never told him everything. I had never told anyone everything. But something in the way he waited, calm, patient, resolute, made me feel safe, made me feel seen. And so, for the first time, I told him. I told him about the nights Javier came home angry because I succeeded at something small, fixing a computer issue, balancing our finances better than he could, solving problems he couldn't handle. I told him how he belittled me whenever he felt insecure, how he called me overreacting when I tried to express how much it hurt. I told him how he once mocked me in front of his friends for speaking English too well, as if intelligence were an insult. I told him how he convinced me not to take the job in Dallas because a wife's place is near her husband. I told him how I took a smaller job instead, one that paid less and challenged me even less, because Javier couldn't handle the idea of me outgrowing him. I told him how I hid my bank statements from myself so I wouldn't feel guilty spending money on things that brought me joy. I told him how I slowly stopped wearing makeup because he said it made me look like I was trying too hard. I told him how he rolled his eyes when I talked about my childhood dreams, saying dreams were for people with time, time he made sure I never had. And then I told him about the worst part. The way Javier dismissed Valeria whenever she needed affection, telling me that emotional parenting was a mother's job, while he was too tired, or too stressed, or too busy, scrolling through his phone pretending the world owed him something. When I finished, my father didn't speak. He didn't react. He didn't curse Javier's name or rage on my behalf. Instead, he reached across the table and took my hand in his palm warm and steady. "You deserved better," he said quietly. much better. The simplicity of his words broke me. Tears slid down my cheeks before I could stop them. But this time, I didn't cry because I was weak. I cried because I had finally stopped lying to myself. I wiped my face and straightened my shoulders. "So, what do we do now?" I asked. "We heal," he said, "and we build." At precisely 9 o'clock, the Alvarez Enterprises legal team arrived. Sharp suits, leather briefcases, and the fierce loyalty my father commanded. They spread paperwork across the dining table and explained every step of what would happen next. Separation filing, asset protection, custody preparation, and documentation of financial and emotional abuse. Their words were clinical, professional, emotionless, yet they gave me more comfort than any sweet apology Javier had ever given me after one of his insults. While they talked, the surveillance team notified my father that Javier had returned to the gates again. This time, he wasn't screaming. He was crying, begging, pleading. I didn't go to the window. I didn't need to. I knew his pattern. When anger failed, he reached for pity. When pity failed, he reached for manipulation. But there were no more doors for him to walk through, no more chances for him to poison my peace. The new me, the woman who had finally opened her eyes, would not offer herself as a sacrifice ever again. My father watched me closely, as if measuring the strength of my resolve. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked softly. I lifted my chin, feeling something inside me settle into place like a lock clicking shut. "Yes," I said. "This time, I choose myself." My father nodded once, pride glimmering in his eyes. "Then, let's proceed." And as the papers were placed in front of me, as the morning sun poured into the room, like a blessing, I felt no fear, no hesitation, no doubt. Because I knew, for the first time in many years, that I was finally walking in the direction of my own life, and I wasn't going back. The separation papers were still warm from the printer when Javier made his next move. By noon, the estate's front gates buzzed once more, but this time, he wasn't alone. Through the security cameras, we saw him arrive in a black sedan alongside a woman in a stiff suit and a man carrying a leather briefcase. For one absurd second, I thought perhaps he had found a counselor, someone to mediate, someone willing to sit with us and untangle the years of words left unsaid. But no. Javier Morales didn't come for reconciliation. He came for war. The woman stepped out first, smoothing her blazer, her posture stiff with arrogance. The man followed, adjusting his glasses and flipping open a binder so thick it looked like it contained the history of every bad decision Javier had ever made. I recognized the type instantly, the kind of attorney who cared less about truth and more about winning, the kind who fed on conflict the way vultures feed on what's already dying. Javier pressed the intercom button with the confidence of a man who believed the universe still spun in his direction. "Marisol!" he shouted into the microphone. "I brought people to help us talk like adults." My father stood behind me, arms crossed, eyes narrowing. "He brought lawyers," he murmured. "He wants to intimidate you." I didn't respond. I simply watched the screen as Javier's attorney leaned into the intercom. "This is Ms. Delgado, legal counsel. Under Texas law, we are here to conduct a wellness check and discuss potential concerns regarding Mrs. Marisol Morales' mental well-being." My jaw clenched, my stomach twisted. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Of all the cards Javier could play, he chose the dirtiest. The one cowards use. The one manipulators pull from their sleeve when control slips from their fingers. He was trying to declare me mentally unstable. He wanted to paint me as irrational, emotional, in crisis. The classic attacks used on women for centuries. And he wanted to use the law to do it. My father laid a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Hija," he said softly, "let me handle this." But I stepped forward, my heartbeat loud enough to drown out everything else. "No," I whispered. "I need to hear it." Javier pressed the intercom again, his voice cracked theatrically, dripping with false concern. "Marisol, I know things have been strange. I know you're overwhelmed. I know you're confused. But trying to shut me out isn't healthy. We're just trying to make sure you're okay." The anger hit me like a shockwave. Overwhelmed? Confused? Not okay? He was trying to rewrite years of his abuse into a narrative where I looked unstable and he looked like the hero. My father squeezed my arm gently, one small reminder not to let my fury swallow me. But the rage wasn't wild anymore. It wasn't chaotic. It was controlled, focused, sharp. "Marisol," the attorney's voice crackled through the speaker, "if you refuse a wellness evaluation that may be submitted as evidence of impaired judgment, we can request an emergency court hearing if needed." My father interjected before she could finish. He stepped to the intercom with a calmness that froze the air. "This is Don Rafael Alvarez," he said. "Mrs. Morales is not available for intimidation tactics today. If you have concerns, you may address them with her legal representation. Any further attempts to force entry or harass her will be documented and submitted to authorities." The attorney attempted a rebuttal. "Mr. Alvarez, with all due respect," my father cut her off. "You are trespassing on private property, and your client has been repeatedly asked to leave. If you do not vacate the premises immediately, I will contact the police." I watched Javier's face contort, the confusion, the panic, the disbelief that his performance wasn't working. He wasn't used to being ignored. He wasn't used to being powerless. And now, the world was no longer bending itself around his ego. He leaned into the microphone again, his voice cracking. "Marisol, please just talk to me. You're not thinking clearly. You need me. You can't just cut me out like this. You're my wife." Wife. The word tasted like rust. Old, corroded, worthless. I reached for the intercom before my father could stop me, and when I spoke, my voice surprised even me. Steady, calm, sharp enough to cut through the entire street. "Javier," I said, "we are done. You no longer have access to me. Not my life, not my home, not my daughter." He flinched as if slapped. "I am not the confused one," I continued. "I am not the unstable one. I am not the one who wasted every blessing handed to him. You don't get to twist this. Not anymore." His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Leave," I said. before you embarrass yourself further." And with that, I pressed the button to disconnect the intercom. The sudden silence was glorious, but Javier wasn't finished. Not yet. He pounded on the metal gates, shouting obscenities, accusations, and empty threats. His attorney tried to calm him, but pride is a wild animal, and Javier had fed his for years. Then, as if summoned by fate, 2 police cruisers turned onto the street, lights flashing. Not because my father had called them this time. Someone else in the neighborhood must have reported the disturbance. The officers stepped out, hands on their belts, speaking to Javier calmly at first. When he pointed at the house, yelling that his wife had been brainwashed and held hostage, the officers exchanged a look that said everything. They had seen men like him before, many times. Within minutes, they escorted him to the sidewalk and instructed him to leave the neighborhood. His attorney whispered fiercely in his ear, trying to salvage the situation, but humiliation hung around him like Texas humidity. Thick, sticky, impossible to shake. Eventually, he climbed into the sedan with the attorney and drove away, the tires screeching across the pavement. I watched the car go until it turned the corner and disappeared completely. Only then did my father speak. "That," he said, "was the first battle." I turned to him slowly. "How many more will there be?" He didn't sugarcoat it. "As many as it takes." I took a deep breath, letting the truth settle into my bones. Javier wasn't going to accept losing control. Elena wasn't going to forgive public humiliation. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. And yet, I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Because, for the first time, maybe in my entire life, I wasn't fighting alone. And I wasn't fighting blind. I was fighting as the woman I had once hidden. The woman who was finally awake. The ready woman. For the next 3 days, I waited for the peace to crack. I knew it wouldn't last, not with Javier's pride bruised and Elena's reputation shredded so loudly across San Antonio that even the women at the panaderia whispered about her being dragged out of the Mercedes like a shoplifter. The quiet that settled over my father's estate felt unnatural, like the air was holding its breath. I kept expecting the gates to buzz, expecting Javier to reappear with some new stunt, expecting Elena to storm up with her dramatic sighs and crocodile tears. But nothing happened. And in that silence, something strange began to bloom inside me. Freedom. Not full freedom. Not yet. But the first fragile taste of it. Like a breath taken after being underwater too long. I spent those days with Valeria, who had been too young to understand the fight happening around her, but old enough to sense tension thick as summer heat. She clung to me more than usual, and I held her a little tighter each time. We walked through the Alvarez gardens, picking lemons from trees my father planted decades ago, feeding the koi fish in the courtyard pond, watching the deer graze on the edges of the estate. I had forgotten how peaceful life could feel away from Javier's constant demands, away from his criticisms, away from his drama, away from the heavy cloud of insecurity that followed him into every room. One evening, I sat with her under the large mesquite tree near the back of the property, the sky painted orange and purple the way only Texas skies can manage. She curled against my side, her little fingers playing with the edge of my blouse. "Mommy," she whispered. Why did Daddy yell the other day? For a moment, my heart cracked, not because of Javier, but because I realized how many times Valeria had heard our arguments, how many times she had seen him dismiss me, how many times she had absorbed pain I thought I was hiding. I brushed a hand through her hair. Daddy was having a hard time controlling his anger, I said gently. But you and I are safe here, mi amor. You don't have to worry. She nodded, trusting me completely, and in that moment, I made a promise to myself. Javier would never again be allowed to shape her childhood with the same darkness he used to shape my marriage. But peace, as I knew too well, never lasts when it threatens someone who depends on chaos to survive. On the fourth morning, just before sunrise, the estate's intercom buzzed with a sharpness that jolted me awake. My heart leapt. My breath caught. I knew before I even reached the security room that it would be him. But it wasn't Javier. Not this time. It was a sheriff's deputy car parked outside the gate, lights flashing discreetly, and standing beside it were two unfamiliar faces. One woman with a clipboard, one man with a badge clipped to his belt. A sinking feeling spread through my stomach. My father joined me in front of the monitors, his jaw tightening. They filed something, he murmured. He wouldn't dare, I said. But even as the words left my lips, I knew Javier Morales would dare anything to regain control. The intercom crackled. This is Deputy Harris with Bexar County Sheriff's Office, the officer announced. We're here to conduct a court-ordered wellness check on Mrs. Marisol Morales. The words hit me like ice water. Court-ordered. Javier had escalated things beyond lawyers, beyond threats, beyond shouting at gates. He had filed a petition questioning my mental stability. He wanted the state involved. He wanted documentation. He wanted power. My father stepped forward to the intercom, voice steady but sharp. This is private property, he said. What documentation do you have? The deputy held up a packet toward the camera. We have assigned judicial authorization based on concerns provided by the petitioner. I didn't need to read the documents to know what lies Javier had written inside them. Emotional instability, erratic behavior, refusal to communicate, possible depressive episodes, possible endangerment to myself or Valeria. Every insult he had thrown at me during fights was now dressed in legal language and handed to the sheriff as evidence. The woman beside the deputy spoke next, her tone crisp and professional. I'm Miss Thompson, a social investigator for the court. We need to speak directly with Mrs. Morales to complete the evaluation. We have the authority to request temporary custody orders if we suspect any risk to the child. My knees weakened. My breath left me. Valeria. They were threatening to use my daughter against me. My father placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me. Marisol, he whispered, you are calm. You are clear. You have nothing to fear. But trauma doesn't listen to logic. Trauma listens to the echoes of every time Javier made me doubt myself. I wasn't afraid of the truth. I was afraid of the story Javier had created. My father opened the gate remotely, just enough for the officers to enter on foot. He trusted the law enough to let them in, but not enough to let them do this without witnesses. We met them in the front courtyard, the early Texas sun casting long shadows across the gravel. I stood tall, shoulders squared, even though my heart thudded with old panic. "Mrs. Morales," the deputy said carefully, "we're here to check on your well-being as mandated." "I understand," I replied, my voice calm even though my hands trembled. "Then, let's proceed." The social worker opened her clipboard, assessing me with professional detachment. "Have you experienced any emotional distress recently?" I held her gaze. "I experienced years of emotional distress with my husband. Leaving him is the healthiest choice I've ever made." She blinked, caught off guard. "Are you currently on any medication?" "No, not for mental health, only vitamins." "Have you had trouble sleeping, eating, managing responsibilities?" "I'm raising my daughter, living with family, and handling legal matters with clarity," I said. "I am not in crisis." She continued her checklist, but I could already see it. The shift in her expression, the subtle nods, the way she scribbled notes with increasing certainty. The deputy walked the perimeter, checking the environment. My father's security team stood by, silent but alert. Finally, Miss Thompson closed her folder. "Mrs. Morales," she said, "I see no signs of mental impairment. You appear coherent, responsible, and stable. I will be filing a report stating there is no basis for concern." Relief washed over me. Not a gentle relief, but one sharp enough to sting. The deputy nodded. "We'll document the findings with the court. You can expect the issue to be dismissed." As they left, the tension in my chest loosened just enough for me to breathe again. My father exhaled, a slow, controlled release of a breath he'd held for far too long. "He tried to take your dignity," he said softly. "And when he failed, he tried to take your sanity." I closed my eyes, letting the truth sink in. "He will try again," I whispered. "Yes," my father said, "but now you're ready." And he was right, because this time I wasn't the quiet wife waiting for someone to rescue me. I was the woman becoming herself again, strong, awake, unshakable. And I would not let Javier Morales rewrite my story ever again. After the wellness check cleared my name, I expected Javier to retreat, to lick his wounds in silence, to take a breath before striking again. But some men do not heal. They reload. And instead of accepting that the world was finally holding him accountable, Javier Morales moved like a man who believed the universe had made a mistake he intended to correct. By the end of the week, the papers arrived. A formal lawsuit filed in Bazar County Family Court, requesting a full mental competency evaluation, temporary guardianship over me, and shared custody of Valeria. Shared custody. The words made my stomach twist with a sickening heaviness. I had spent years sacrificing myself for that child, protecting her from Javier's temper, shielding her from the emotional whiplash of his moods, shaping her world with love he never bothered to give. And now, he wanted half of her life handed to him on a legal platter. I stood in my father's office as he read the petition, his jaw tightening with every line. "He claims you're unstable," my father said slowly, "that you're being manipulated, that you're unfit to care for Valeria." My throat went dry. "Manipulated?" "By me," he clarified with a hint of a cold smile. "Apparently, I have coercive influence over you." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Javier had spent years tearing at my confidence, and now He wanted to accuse my father, the one person who had protected and uplifted me, of manipulating me. It was insanity. But insanity, written into a legal document, suddenly became dangerous. My father set the papers down, eyes sharpening into something lethal. "He's desperate," he said, "and desperate men are reckless." My father's legal team moved quickly, spreading stacks of files across his desk: bank statements, text messages, work records, the wellness report from the sheriff's deputy, and psychological evaluations clearing me of any instability. They organized my life on paper: my competence, my stability, my devotion to Valeria. Everything Javier had twisted into lies, they brought back into truth. Still, despite the evidence, I felt a familiar tremor inside me, a fear born from years of conditioning, a fear whispered into my mind every time Javier raised his voice or narrowed his eyes. What if he wins? What if I lose Valeria? What if his lies drown out my truth? My father must have sensed the shift inside me. He placed a firm hand on my back, grounding me. "Mija," he said quietly, "you survived years with that man. Do not let a stack of papers intimidate you now." I nodded, but the fear still pulsed beneath my ribs. That night, after dinner, I sat in my childhood room with the legal documents spread across my bed. I traced the edges of each page, my fingers trembling as I imagined the courtroom, the judge, the possibility, however small, that the system might fail me. Every Latina woman I knew had at least one story about courts not believing them, about men weaponizing the law, about motherhood becoming a battlefield. I thought of Valeria sleeping peacefully down the hall, her little body curled beneath blankets printed with stars. She was the one star in my life that had not dimmed. And now, Javier wanted to tear her world apart to satisfy his wounded pride. I refused to let him. 2 days later, the first hearing was scheduled. I dressed in a simple navy dress, one that fit me well but didn't attract attention, one that said, "I am steady and I am capable," without needing to shout it. My father drove me to the courthouse, his presence a shield, his silence a comfort. When we arrived, the Morales family was already inside. Elena perched on a bench with exaggerated sadness dripping from her face. Javier pacing back and forth like a caged animal. He looked up when I entered, and the expression he wore made my skin crawl. An unsettling mix of arrogance and desperation, the face of a man who believed he still had power. Elena whispered something to him, no doubt adding fuel to his delusions. My father and I took our seats, and the lawyers filed in. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The formalities felt distant, surreal, like I was watching a scene from someone else's life. Then it began. Javier's attorney stood first, clearing her throat dramatically before launching into a speech dripping with false concern. "Your Honor," she said, "we have reason to believe that Mrs. Morales is experiencing emotional instability, influenced by undue pressure from her father. There have been concerning behavioral changes." She went on and on, building her case on sand, her words collapsing the moment the wind shifted. But lies are still dangerous when spoken with confidence. Then it was Javier's turn. He took the stand, and for a moment, a small, fleeting moment, I wondered if he would tell the truth. Javier always knew how to pretend vulnerability when it benefited him. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was not remorse. It was betrayal. My wife hasn't been herself, he said, voice trembling with manufactured pain. She's been unstable, forgetful, emotional. She shut me out, refused to talk to me, and made decisions that put our family at risk. I'm worried about her. I just want to make sure she's safe. Safe. The word tasted like poison. Safe from what? From him? From the life he destroyed? I felt my nails dig into my palms as the judge listened. My father's attorney rose to respond, but the judge lifted a hand. "Let's hear from Mrs. Morales," he said. My pulse quickened. My breath caught. Then I stood. I walked to the stand with steady steps, refusing to let my fear guide me. The courtroom watched as I took my seat. The judge looked at me, his expression neutral but attentive. "Mrs. Morales," he said, "tell us your perspective." And so I did. I spoke clearly, calmly, unshaken. I told the truth. Not the embellished truth, not the softened truth, not the polite truth, the real truth. I explained the emotional manipulation, the insecurity, the years of belittling comments, the silent suffering, and the growing fear of raising Valeria in a home full of instability. I spoke of the wellness check, the sheriff's report, the psychological evaluation clearing me. "I am not unstable," I said, my voice unwavering. "I am not a danger to myself or to my daughter." The danger was staying married to a man who made me feel small every day. The danger was silence, and I am done being silent. When I finished, the courtroom was still. Even Javier stopped fidgeting. The judge looked through the documents again. The wellness report, the social worker's notes, the police log from the night Javier screamed at the gates. Then he looked at Javier. "Mr. Morales," he said, "your petition lacks evidence. In fact, the documentation strongly supports the opposite of your claims. The court finds no indication that Mrs. Morales is mentally unfit or unstable." Relief washed through me, not a gentle wave, but a crashing tide. Then the judge added something that made Javier's face blanch. "Furthermore, your repeated attempts to question her mental health without basis may be considered harassment." Harassment. The word echoed like a verdict. The judge dismissed the petition. Case closed. The moment his gavel hit the desk, something inside me cracked, not from pain, but from liberation. Javier stood frozen, his attorney whispering furiously to him, Elena glaring daggers at me. But their anger no longer touched me, because I had won something far greater than a legal battle. I had won myself back. And I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, that I was never going back to the woman I had been before. After the judge dismissed the case, the courtroom emptied slowly, as if everyone felt the weight of what had just happened. My body felt strangely light, like I had shed a skin I didn't realize I had been carrying for years. Javier remained frozen in his seat, staring at the papers as if they were in another language. His attorney whispered sharply at him, and Elena clutched her purse with those trembling manicured fingers, her face contorted in a mixture of rage and disbelief. They had expected to win. They had expected the system to bend for them, the way I once bent for Javier. But not this time. Not ever again. When my father and I stepped out into the Texas sun, the air felt different, warmer, brighter, almost celebratory. Even the cicadas sounded like they were singing louder. It's over, my father murmured, but I knew better. Legal battles end with gavels. Emotional ones end with choices. And I had one more choice to make. Days passed, and life at the Alvarez estate settled into a new normal. Valeria resumed her routine, playing in the courtyard, feeding the koi fish, snuggling beside me at night, her little arms wrapped around me with a tenderness that healed everything Javier had broken. I watched her laugh, learn, grow, and each day I felt a little of my old self return. The woman who once dreamed big, who thought her life could make a difference, who believed she had something meaningful to offer the world. She was no longer a ghost haunting the corners of my mind. She was waking up. My father noticed it too. One morning, he found me sitting in the sunroom with my laptop open, reading through old files from university. Projects I had abandoned, research I had once led, opportunities I had thrown away because Javier feared them. "You're remembering who you were," my father said softly. "No," I replied, meeting his eyes for the first time with confidence I hadn't felt in years. "I'm remembering who I am." He nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting into the faintest smile, the kind he saved for proud moments. "Then, let's talk about your future," he said. And we did. For hours, for days, for weeks. My father opened doors for me, not because he wanted to control my path, but because he saw who I had been before Javier dimmed my light. He introduced me to mentors, leaders, engineers, innovators, people who looked at me with respect, not condescension, people who saw potential, not inconvenience, people who valued brilliance, not silence. And slowly, almost shyly, I began to consider rebuilding the future I had once walked away from. I wasn't sure where I belonged yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I was done shrinking. I was done hiding. I was done apologizing for existing. And then, unexpectedly, an email arrived. A message from a prestigious tech firm in Austin, one I had once dreamed of joining. The subject line read, "We'd like to reconnect, Mrs. Alvarez." I stared at it for a long time, my heart beating faster with each passing second. My father saw the fear flicker across my face. "Hija," he said gently, "you no longer have to choose between your brilliance and your peace. You can have both." I finally opened the message. They had remembered me. My old professor had recommended me again. My thesis had circulated through the company years ago, and they had never forgotten my name. They wanted to talk. They wanted to see where I was now. They wanted to offer me a chance. When I closed the laptop, tears blurred my vision. Not sadness, not regret, gratitude, relief, renewal. Later that evening, I sat outside under the mesquite tree where Valeria and I often rested. The sky was a deep violet, the stars beginning to appear one by one. Valeria curled next to me, her head resting on my lap. "Mommy," she said sleepily, "are we going to stay here forever?" I brushed a hand through her soft hair. "Forever is a long time," I whispered, "but we'll stay here long enough for you to feel safe, long enough for me to grow again. Her small fingers curled around mine. I like it here, she murmured. It feels happy. My throat tightened. Me too, mi cielo. For the first time, the word future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise. A few more weeks passed, and during that time, Javier tried to contact me less and less. His messages shifting from rage to guilt to silence. Elena withdrew completely from public life, hiding from the humiliation of her breakdown at La Cantera Mall. Whatever illusions they once built about their superiority dissolved under the weight of their actions, and I was left standing with something more precious than victory: clarity, freedom, self-respect. Eventually, I filed for divorce. Javier didn't fight it. The man who once tried to control every breath I took seemed to crumble the moment he realized nothing he said or did could bring back the woman he had depended on. Not the obedient wife, not the silent partner, not the person who sacrificed herself for him. That woman no longer existed. I was someone new, someone older, wiser, stronger, someone who remembered her worth, someone who remembered her dreams, someone who refused to be dimmed ever again. When the divorce was finalized, I stood on the steps of the courthouse with Valeria's hand in mine. The Texas sun shone bright overhead, warm and steady. "Mommy," she asked, "what happens now?" I looked down at her, this little girl who had survived the storm with me, who had become my anchor, my light. And I smiled, a real smile, the kind that comes from truth, not pretense. "Now," I said, "we start over." And I meant it, every word, because starting over didn't feel like failure anymore. It felt like redemption. It felt like a rebirth. It felt like choosing myself, finally, fully, without apology. As we walked to the car, hand in hand, I realized something profound. I hadn't just survived Javier. I hadn't just escaped him. I had reclaimed myself. My story didn't end with heartbreak. It ended with awakening, with freedom, with the promise of a life I would build on my own terms. And as the sun dipped low across the Texas horizon, turning the sky gold, I whispered a silent vow to myself, one I intended to keep for the rest of my days. I will never shrink again. Not for a man, not for fear, not for anyone. Sono Marisol Alvarez, and I am finally, beautifully, fiercely free.